She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The man who left her standing at the altar was back, with a beautiful wife on his arm, and zero regrets. Then a stranger stepped up behind her and said something that changed everything. What he did next, she never asked for, and never forgot. This channel is where the Old West lives on, in stories of quiet cowboys with great hearts, love that grows from the ruins of heartbreak, and the beautiful truth that one stranger's kindness can change the entire course of a life. This story proves that what breaks you open isn't always the worst thing. Sometimes it's the very thing that makes room for something real. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community. If this story stayed with you, hit like, drop a comment with your favorite moment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe so you never miss a story worth holding on to.
The moment the dust cleared on Main Street, Bethany Zimmerman laid eyes on the couple stepping out of the stagecoach, and it felt like her heart clean stopped beating. 3 long years had gone by since Thomas Whitmore called off their engagement just 2 weeks before the wedding, saying he had to go find himself out in California. And now, right here in Oregon City, he stood with a dainty blonde woman on his arm, her fine silk dress glinting in the cruel August sun of 1876. Bethany's hand clenched around the handle of her supply basket, her knuckles turning bone white as she watched Thomas guide his wife down the wooden steps. He was so gentle and protective with her, a way he had never once been with Bethany. She knew she ought to turn right around, slip back into the general store or duck into the alley, but her boots felt like they were nailed right to the boardwalk. The September heat bore down on her shoulders like a heavy hand, making the calico of her dress stick right to her back. She had poured everything into putting her life back together after Thomas left. She took over her father's seamstress shop after he passed last winter, and earned a good name in this frontier town with nothing but hard work and a steady hand with a needle. And now, all of that hard-won pride felt like it was about to turn to dust, because she could not get her feet to move. Thomas had not spotted her yet. He was laughing at something his wife whispered, his head tilted back with a kind of pure joy he had never shown her. Bethany felt that old hurt rip open, as fresh and raw as the day it happened. She had loved him, or at least she thought she had. But what stung more was the deep shame of being left, of being the one who was not good enough to keep. You aim to stand there all day, or are you going to move before you lose all feeling in your hands? The voice came from right behind her, a low, warm sound with a little bit of humor in it, and Bethany jumped so hard the basket nearly tumbled from her grasp. She whirled around and found herself looking up at a tall man dressed in worn denim and a brown leather vest. His dark hair was a little long under his dusty hat, and his eyes were the color of good whiskey catching the light. She had noticed him around town over the last month, a quiet fellow who mostly kept to himself, but they had never spoken a word. "I'm sorry, I was just," she began, but the rest of the words caught in her throat when Thomas's voice boomed across the street. Bethany Zimmerman, is that you?" The cowboy's gaze shifted from her face to the couple now making their way across the dusty road toward them, and a look of sharp understanding crossed his features. Before Bethany could figure out what to do or say, the stranger moved a little closer, his presence feeling solid and safe at her back. "Friend of yours?" he asked in a low voice, though she had a feeling he already knew the answer. "Not quite," she managed to whisper, her throat feeling tight with 100 different feelings. Thomas reached them, his wife still holding onto his arm. Up close, Bethany could see he looked well off, with a fine, tailored suit and boots polished to a mirror shine. His wife was even prettier than she looked from far away, with eyes the color of blue cornflowers and perfect pink lips turned up in a curious smile. "Bethany, I just cannot believe it." "What are the odds?" Thomas said, sounding truly happy to see her. "You look good. This town must be treating you right." "I am doing just fine," Bethany replied, working hard to keep her voice even. I am running my father's shop these days. Oh, that is right. I did hear about your father. I am sorry for your loss. Thomas's face took on a sympathetic look, but it felt like he was just playing a part. This is my wife, Eleanor. We have been married for a little over 2 years. We met out in San Francisco. What a city that is. Nothing at all like this little town, I can tell you. Eleanor held out a gloved hand with an easy sort of grace. It is so lovely to meet you, Miss Zimmerman. Any friend of Thomas's is a friend of mine. The words were polite enough, but they stung like salt in a fresh wound. Bethany took the offered hand for a second, feeling how rough her own working fingers were against Eleanor's softness. She could still feel the cowboy standing close behind her, a quiet strength that somehow made her feel a little less alone. "What brings you back to Oregon City?" Bethany asked, though what she really wanted to ask was why on earth he thought she would be happy to see him. "Business, as a matter of fact," Thomas said, puffing out his chest a bit. "I have done pretty well for myself in the shipping business, and I am thinking about expanding my work into the Oregon territory. We will be in town for a few weeks while I meet with folks and check out the possibilities." A few weeks. The words landed on Bethany like a punch to the gut. She figured this would be a quick, painful run-in she could get through and then forget. But the thought of seeing Thomas and his perfect wife all over town for weeks, of having to smile and act like it did not bother her one bit, felt like an impossible task. "That sounds very successful," she said, but her voice came out quieter than she had wanted. "I hope you find what you are looking for." "We ought to have dinner together while we are here," Thomas suggested, completely missing how pale Bethany had become. "Catch up on old times. I would love to hear all about what you have been doing, and I'm sure Eleanor would like to get to know the town from someone who actually lives here." "I reckon Miss Zimmerman might already have plans for her evenings," the cowboy said, his voice cutting through Thomas's cheerful chatter with a quiet power, "seeing as how we have plans most nights." Bethany's head snapped around to stare at him, but his face was calm and friendly, though his eyes held a clear challenge as he looked at Thomas. The stranger shifted just a bit, and his hand rested lightly on the small of her back. The touch was proper, but it was also clear as day that he was claiming her. Thomas's eyebrows shot up as his eyes darted between Bethany and the cowboy, plain surprise on his face. "Oh, I did not know you were seeing someone." "This is Quinn Dalton," Bethany said in a rush, her mind scrambling to keep up with the sudden turn of events. "He is, We are getting acquainted," Quinn finished for her, smooth as you please, his hand still warm and steady on her back. "And I am afraid I keep her pretty busy. But I am sure you folks will see her around town during your visit. Oregon City is not that big." Eleanor was watching the whole thing with sharp eyes, and Bethany wondered if she could see right through the lie, if she knew that Bethany and Quinn had never said more than "how do you do" before this very minute. But Eleanor's smile did not flicker one bit, and she gave Thomas's arm a gentle squeeze. "Of course we understand completely," Eleanor said with warmth. "It was lovely to meet you both. I am sure we will see you around." Thomas looked like he had more to say, his face a mix of confusion and maybe a little annoyance that Bethany was not just free to show him around the town he had left behind. But Eleanor was already leading him away, saying something about checking into their hotel, and just like that they were gone, disappearing down the boardwalk. Bethany stood there frozen for a few long moments after they had left, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her own ears. Then Quinn's hand left her back, and the sudden loss of his touch was enough to break the spell. She turned to face him, not sure if she should thank him or ask him what in the world he thought he was doing. "I apologize if I overstepped my bounds," Quinn said before she could get a word out, tipping his hat back just enough for her to see his face better. "But you looked like you were about to fall apart, and I figured you did not really want to have supper with that pair." "You figured right," Bethany admitted, finally letting out a shaky breath. He was the man you were supposed to marry, I'm guessing, judging by the look on your face when you saw him." It was not a question, but Bethany nodded anyway. "He left me 3 years ago. Broke it off right before we were to be married. I did not know he had married someone else. I sure did not expect him to ever come back here." A flicker of anger passed through Quinn's eyes, making his expression darken. "Well, that takes a special kind of fool," To leave a woman like you and then show up thinking you would be glad to see him. The simple compliment, said with no fuss at all, sent a surprising warmth spreading through Bethany's chest. Thank you for stepping in. I do not think I could have made it through dinner with them. You do not owe that man a single thing. Not your time and not your politeness, Quinn said, his voice firm. Then his face softened with a bit of a grin, though I suppose I might have made things a little more complicated by saying we were courting. If that causes you any trouble, I truly am sorry. No, actually, it might just make these next few weeks possible, Bethany said, the idea forming in her mind as she spoke the words. If they think I am with someone, Thomas might just leave me be instead of trying to act like we are old friends. I do not want that. Quinn looked at her for a long moment, and his clever eyes seemed to understand more than she was saying. Are you suggesting we ought to pretend we are courting, keep this whole thing going while they are in town? Would you be willing to do that? Bethany asked, hearing the desperate hope in her own voice and not even caring. I know it is a crazy thing to ask, and we do not even know each other, but I just cannot face them on my own. I cannot endure weeks of being pitied or stacked up against his perfect wife. You would not be the one who comes up short in that comparison, Quinn said, his voice low. The sincerity in his words made Bethy's breath catch in her throat. And yes, he continued, I would be willing to help you. It just seems like the right thing to do. A wave of relief washed over Bethany, so strong it brought a sting of tears to her eyes. Thank you, I mean it. I will make this worth your time, I swear. I could cook for you or mend your clothes. Or, how about we just call it helping each other out? Quinn interrupted softly. No need for payment. Sometimes a person just needs to have someone on their side. They stood on that boardwalk, with the afternoon sun warming their faces and the sounds of town all around them. And Bethany felt a definite shift deep inside her chest. This man, a stranger, had just stepped up to defend her for no good reason. He had thrown her a lifeline and asked for nothing in return, and now she felt a sudden urge to know every single thing about him. I reckon I ought to know more about you if we are going to make folks believe we are courting, she said, trying to bring some common sense back into the moment. Where are you from? What kind of work do you do? The corner of Quinn's mouth twitched into what was nearly a smile. I am a horse wrangler, for the most part. I have been wandering the territory, breaking wild horses for ranchers and helping out on cattle drives. I rode into town about a month ago and have been picking up odd jobs while I figure out what is next. Why Oregon City? Bethany asked, her curiosity now fully awake. I heard the land was good out here. The weather is a whole lot better than some other places I have been, Quinn said with a small shrug. I have been thinking about settling down, maybe starting my own ranch, if I can manage to pull together enough money. I'm 25 years old. I figure it is high time I put down some roots instead of just drifting along. Bethany felt some of her tension ease away. He was close to her own age of 23, not some grizzled old cowpoke or a wild young buck looking for trouble. There was a steadiness about him, a solid and dependable quality in the way he stood. I live in the rooms above the seamstress shop on 3rd Street, she told him. I took over my father's business when he passed on. It is not much, but it keeps a roof over my head and food on my table. Running your own business at 23, Quinn said, and his voice was full of respect. That is mighty impressive. No one had ever called her impressive. Practical, sure, and hard-working, absolutely. But impressive was a new one, and Bethany discovered she liked the sound of it. We should probably be seen around town together if we want anyone to believe this, she said, her practical side taking over again. Perhaps you could walk me home. My shop is not very far. I would be mighty happy to, Quinn said. And this time he gave her a full, genuine smile that changed his whole face from just handsome to something that made Bethy's heart beat a little faster. He offered her his arm with a touch of old-fashioned manners, and after just a moment of hesitation, she took it. As they walked down Main Street together, Bethany was keenly aware of the curious looks they got from the townspeople. Quinn Dalton had mostly kept to himself since he got to Oregon City. He was not unfriendly, just not one for socializing, so seeing him with the town's most available seamstress was bound to get folks talking. But for the first time in a long while, Bethany did not mind being the topic of gossip. Let them talk. Let Thomas get wind that she had moved on, that she had found a man who actually wanted to be seen in her company. "Tell me something real about yourself," Quinn said as they made the turn onto 3rd Street. Something more than just the plain facts. The question caught her by surprise, and Bethany had to give it some thought. "I hate sewing," she admitted at last. "I am good at it, and I need the money it brings in, but I do not have the love for it that my father did. What I truly enjoy is reading. I have a whole shelf of books back in my rooms, and sometimes I stay up way too late just because I cannot bear to put a story down." "What kind of books?" Quinn asked, and he sounded truly interested. "Adventure stories, mostly. Novels about folks exploring new lands and having all sorts of excitement. It is a silly thing, I suppose, reading about adventures when my own life is so quiet." "It is not silly at all," Quinn said with firmness in his voice. "Everybody needs a way to escape now and then. And who is to say your life will always be so quiet?" They arrived at the seamstress shop, a tidy little building with clean windows showing off some of Bethy's handiwork. She reluctantly let go of Quinn's arm, not quite wanting him to go, but not knowing how to ask him to stay either. "Thank you again for everything today," she said. "You really saved me from a terrible situation. Like I told you, it just seemed like the decent thing to do." Quinn tipped his hat to her, a gesture that felt both respectful and personal all at once. "I will stop by tomorrow if that's all right with you. Maybe we could take another walk. Let folks see us together again." "I would like that," Bethany said. And she meant it more than she ever expected. She watched him walk on down the street, his long stride easy and sure, and she wondered just what she had talked herself into. This was supposed to be a simple deal, just a way to keep Thomas and his unwelcome attention at bay, and to stop the pitying looks from the townspeople who remembered her public shame. But there was something about Quinn Dalton that was stirring up feelings she had not felt in years, making her want things she had talked herself into believing she did not need anymore. The next morning came up clear and warm, another perfect day in a long line of beautiful late summer days. Bethany opened up her shop at 8 o'clock just like always, but her mind was not on her work. She kept finding herself watching the street through her front window instead of hemming the dress she was working on. Was Quinn really going to come by? Or had he had second thoughts overnight? Maybe the whole thing was just a gentlemanly impulse that he was now regretting. But right at 10 o'clock, just when she was starting to give up hope, the bell on the shop door jingled and Quinn walked right in. He had cleaned himself up from the day before. His shirt was fresh and his hair was still a little damp, like he had just stuck his head in a water barrel. He was holding his hat in his hands and looked a little out of place standing there among all the bolts of fabric and dress dummies. He was so clearly out of his natural element that Bethany had to suppress a smile. "Morning," he said. "I hope I'm not pulling you away from your work." "Not at all," Bethany reassured him, putting the dress aside and wiping her hands on her apron. "I was hoping you might stop by." "I told you I would," Quinn said simply, as if keeping his promise was the most natural thing in the whole world. They strolled through town together, taking the long way that went past the church and the little schoolhouse, then past the saloon and the town bank. Bethany kept up a steady chatter, pointing out different buildings and telling Quinn about the people they saw. There was Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house and had an opinion on absolutely everybody's business, and Mr. Chen, who owned the laundry and made the finest dumplings Bethany had ever tasted, and the deputy, Marshall, who was trying to court the preacher's daughter even though her father did not approve one bit. Quinn was more of a listener than a talker. But when he did say something, his comments were sharp and usually made Bethany laugh. He saw things that she had long ago stopped noticing, like how the baker always had a little flower in his left eyebrow but never in his right, or how the banker's wife kept wearing bigger and more ridiculous hats, as if she was trying to outdo the church steeple. They were just passing the hotel when Thomas and Elena stepped out, and Bethany felt her back go rigid out of pure habit. But then Quinn's hand found hers, his fingers warm and rough as they slipped between her own, and that simple touch gave her a surge of strength. "Miss Zimmerman, Mr. Dalton," Elena called out, sounding genuinely pleased. "What a beautiful morning for a walk." "It surely is," Quinn agreed in a friendly voice, holding tight to Bethy's hand. "Are you two settling in okay?" "Ooh. Oh, yes, the hotel is perfectly fine," Thomas said. But his tone made it clear that it was a far cry from what he was used to. His gaze fell to where Quinn and Bethy's hands were linked, and some strange emotion crossed his face. "Though I have to admit," he added, "I am still getting used to being back in a frontier town after living in sophisticated San Francisco. Oregon City has its own kind of charm," Bethany said, lifting her chin just a little. "Not everyone needs big city ways to be happy." "Of course not," Thomas agreed right away, though his smile was condescending. "I just meant that it must seem very different to you, since you have never left this place. You always did have such simple tastes." His words were designed to hurt, to make her feel small and plain compared to his worldly new wife. But before that sting could really set in, Quinn gently stroked his thumb over her knuckles, a quiet reminder that she was not standing there alone. "I have always found that the best things in life are usually the simple ones," Quinn said. His voice was easygoing, but his eyes were like hard stone as he looked straight at Thomas. "Good land, honest work, and folks who keep their promises, things like that. Fancy cities are fine for a visit, I suppose, but I would not want to live in a place that made me forget what is truly important." The hidden jab was soft, but it hit its mark, and a bit of color rose in Thomas's cheeks. Elena, on the other hand, seemed to find the whole thing entertaining, her sharp eyes studying Quinn with a newfound interest. "What a refreshing point of view," she said with real warmth. "Thomas, darling, we really should let these two get on with their walk. We have that meeting with Mr. Fredericks about the warehouse space." Thomas let his wife lead him away, but not before he shot one last puzzled look back at Bethany, as if he just could not understand how his former model, Fiancé, had ended up with someone like Quinn Dalton once they were out of earshot. Bethany let out a long breath. "He always did know exactly what to say to make me feel small." "Then he is either cruel or stupid," Quinn said bluntly. "Probably both. There is nothing small about you, Bethany. You run your own business. You take care of yourself. You built a life after he tried to destroy it. That takes strength most people do not have." Bethany found herself blinking back tears for the second time in as many days. But these were different from the devastated tears she had shed when Thomas first left. These felt almost like relief. Like someone had finally said the words she had needed to hear for 3 long years. "Thank you," she whispered. "You barely know me, but you seem to understand better than people I have known my whole life." "Sometimes distance gives clarity," Quinn said quietly. "And sometimes you just recognize something in another person because you have been through similar things yourself." "You have had your heart broken?" Bethany asked, genuinely curious now. Quinn was quiet for a moment, his expression turning inward. "Not by a woman," he said finally. "But I have known what it is like to be left behind, to feel like you were not good enough. My father made sure I understood that loud and clear before I left home at 16. The casual way he said it did not hide the old pain underneath, and Bethany squeezed his hand without thinking. "I'm sorry. No one should make their child feel that way." "Water under the bridge now," Quinn said, though his return squeeze suggested her sympathy meant something. "Point is, I understand what you are feeling, and I am happy to help make sure that fool and his wife do not make you feel that way again." They continued their walk, their joined hands feeling more natural with each step. By the time Quinn walked her back to her shop, Bethany realized she had genuinely enjoyed herself, had forgotten for long stretches that this was supposed to be an act. The pattern repeated over the next week. Quinn would come by the shop each morning, and they would walk together, sometimes running errands, sometimes just talking. They encountered Thomas and Eleanor twice more, and each time Quinn's presence made the meetings bearable, his quiet support giving Bethany the confidence to hold her head high. But something else was happening too, something neither of them had planned for. The conversations grew deeper, more personal. Quinn told her about growing up on a failing ranch in Texas, about a father who drank too much and blamed his sons for his own failures, about leaving home with nothing but a horse and the clothes on his back. Bethany shared her own stories, about a mother who died when she was 10, about taking care of her grieving father, about the loneliness of watching all her friends marry and start families while she poured herself into work. Quinn started staying for lunch, then for dinner. Bethany discovered he was handy with repairs, and soon he was fixing the loose board on her stairs, the squeaky hinge on her door, the window that never quite closed right. He never asked for payment, but she fed him meals that grew increasingly elaborate, realizing she enjoyed cooking for someone who appreciated it. The people of Oregon City began treating them as an established couple, and neither Bethany nor Quinn corrected the assumption. Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly whenever she saw them together. Mr. Chen started giving Bethany extra dumplings, enough for 2 people. Even the deputy marshal, who had initially been suspicious of the quiet stranger in town, started nodding respectfully when Quinn passed. It was nearly 2 weeks after their arrangement began when everything changed. Bethany was closing up the shop one evening when she heard raised voices outside. She stepped out onto the boardwalk to find Quinn facing off with 2 men she recognized as employees at the lumber mill, both of them clearly drunk and looking for trouble. "Think you are pretty special, do not you?" one of them slurred, swaying slightly. "Coming into town, stealing the prettiest girl around, what makes you so much better than the rest of us?" "I am not looking for trouble," Quinn said calmly, his hands loose at his sides, but his body tense and ready. "Why do not you boys go sleep it off?" "Maybe we do not want to," the second man growled. "Maybe we want to teach you some manners about moving in on our town." Bethany's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to step forward. "Leave him alone, Ben. You have both had too much to drink." "Stay out of this, Bethany," Ben said, barely glancing at her. "This is between men." "There is nothing between anyone," Quinn said firmly. "Go home. Sleep. Tomorrow this will seem foolish." But Ben was already swinging, his fist aimed at Quinn's face with drunken clumsiness. Quinn stepped aside easily, not even bothering to hit back, just letting Ben's own momentum carry him stumbling forward. The second man tried to grab Quinn from behind, but Quinn twisted away, still refusing to throw a punch. "I said, I am not looking for trouble," Quinn repeated, his voice harder now. "Do not make me defend myself." The deputy marshal came running up the street then, attracted by the commotion, and within minutes he had the 2 drunken men in hand, apologizing to Quinn and promising they would spend the night in jail to cool off. Once they were gone, Bethany turned to Quinn with wide eyes. "You could have hit them. You could have ended that in seconds. Why did you not fight back?" "Because fighting should be the last resort, not the first," Quinn said simply. "And because I did not want you to see me that way. Did not want you to think I was violent." The admission was raw and honest, and it hit Bethany right in the chest. He cared what she thought of him. This was not just an act anymore, not just a favor for a woman in trouble. Somewhere along the way, it had become real. "Quinn," she started, not sure what she wanted to say, but needing to say something. "I should go," he interrupted, his voice rough. "Make sure those idiots do not stir up any more trouble." He left before she could respond, and Bethany stood alone on the boardwalk, her heart racing and her mind spinning. Everything had changed, and she was not sure when or how, but she knew with absolute certainty that her feelings for Quinn Dalton were no longer pretend. She did not see him the next day. He did not come by the shop in the morning, and when she walked past the boarding house where he was staying, Mrs. Henderson said he had gone out before dawn and had not returned. Bethany tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting, replaying every conversation, every touch, every moment they had shared. It was late afternoon when her shop door finally opened. But instead of Quinn, Thomas Whitmore walked in. Bethany straightened from the dress she was hemming, surprise and weariness flooding through her. "Thomas," Where is Eleanor? Resting at the hotel. She has not been feeling well. Thomas removed his hat, turning it in his hands in a nervous gesture she remembered from when they were courting. I wanted to talk to you alone, Bethany. I think we need to clear the air. I do not think we have anything to discuss, Bethany said carefully, setting down her needle. I think we do. Thomas moved further into the shop, his expression earnest. I have been watching you these past 2 weeks with that cowboy, and I have been thinking about the past, about us, about the mistake I made. Bethany's stomach dropped. Thomas, do not. I should never have left you, he said, the words coming out in a rush. I was young and stupid and thought I needed adventure, needed to see the world. But what I found was that success means nothing if you do not have the right person beside you. You have Eleanor beside you, Bethany pointed out, her voice cold. Your wife. Eleanor is lovely, but she is not you, Thomas said, stepping closer. She does not understand me the way you did, does not know my history, my roots. These past weeks, seeing you again, remembering what we had, I cannot stop thinking that I made the biggest mistake of my life when I left. Stop talking, Bethany said sharply, anger rising hot and fierce in her chest. You do not get to do this. You do not get to waltz back into my life with your beautiful wife and your successful business and tell me you made a mistake. You are 3 years too late. I know I hurt you, Thomas began. You shattered me, Bethany interrupted, her voice shaking now. You broke our engagement 2 weeks before our wedding, humiliated me in front of the entire town, and left me to pick up the pieces alone. I spent months unable to leave my house without seeing pity in everyone's eyes. I had to rebuild my entire life from nothing. And you think you can just apologize and I will what? Fall back into your arms? I thought maybe we could start over, Thomas said weakly, apparently surprised by her vehemence. If you still have feelings, I have feelings for someone else, Bethany said firmly. And as she said it, she realized it was completely true. Quinn is twice the man you ever were. He is honest and kind, and he shows up when he says he will. He does not make promises he cannot keep, and he does not leave people behind. So no, Thomas, we cannot start over. We are done, and we have been done for 3 years. His face burned red with shame and fury. That drifter, you are picking him over me. Bethany, I am giving you the chance at a real life, not some make-believe story with a horse wrangler who will likely ride off in another month. Bethany's voice was quiet, but sharp as a razor when she said, Get out of my shop. Get out right now, and do not ever come back. Whatever business you have here in Oregon City, you better finish it up fast and be on your way. I do not want to lay eyes on you again. You are making a terrible mistake, Thomas warned, backing his way to the door. You will live to regret this. The only thing I regret is that I ever said yes to marrying you all those years ago, Bethany fired back. Now get out. Thomas stormed out, letting the door slam hard behind him. Bethany collapsed into her chair, trembling from the power of the words she had finally spoken. But underneath all that anger and surprise, she felt a lightness she had not known for years. At long last, she had said what needed saying, had finally defended herself instead of just quietly taking what life handed her. And in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she was in love with Quinn Dalton. The shop door creaked open again, and Bethany's head jerked up, ready to give Thomas another piece of her mind if he had the nerve to show his face again. But it was Quinn standing there, and his expression was as dark as a thundercloud. I was over yonder, across the street, he said, getting straight to the point. I saw that Whitmore fellow come in here. Are you okay? Did he lay a hand on you? Not in the way you mean, Bethany said, her own heart starting to feel whole again just looking at him. He came to tell me he made a mistake by leaving me, that he should have married me instead of Eleanor. Quinn's jaw went tight enough to crack walnuts. And what did you tell him? I told him he was 3 years too late and to get himself out of my shop, Bethany said, rising from her chair and walking toward Quinn. I let him know that my heart is with someone else. A flicker of something crossed Quinn's eyes. It was a mix of hope and fear and a powerful longing, all rolled into one. Do you really have feelings for another? Yes, Bethany said plainly, stopping just inches from him. I have feelings for you, Quinn. These are real feelings, not the pretend kind. And I think they have been there for a good long while, but I was just too afraid to see it. Quinn just looked at her for what felt like an eternity. Bethany's heart was hammering so hard against her ribs, she thought it might just bust loose. Finally, he reached up, his hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that could break you, his thumb gently stroking her skin. I came back here to tell you I cannot keep this up, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I was about to leave town because pretending to court you, when I wanted it to be the real thing, was just eating me alive. But Bethany, if you are telling me what I think you are, I am saying I do not want to pretend anymore, Bethany whispered, leaning into his hand. I'm saying I want this to be real. I am saying I think I am falling in love with you. Quinn let out a sound from deep in his chest, and the next thing she knew, he was kissing her. His lips were warm and sure against hers, and his hands held her face as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Bethany's hands clutched at his vest, pulling him even closer, pouring 3 long years of loneliness and wanting into that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Quinn rested his forehead on hers. I love you, he said with a fierce intensity. I think I have loved you since that first week when you were telling me about your books, and your eyes got that faraway, dreamy look. I kept telling myself this was just a deal, that I was just helping you out, but I was fooling myself the whole time. Well, I reckon that makes us a pair of fools, Bethany said, a small laugh escaping through the tears that were now streaming down her face, falling in. Love while we were just pretending to fall in love. The best kind of fools there are, Quinn agreed. He kissed her again, this time more softly, but it meant just as much. They just stood there in her little shop, holding one another while the evening sun faded outside, and Bethany felt a rightness settle deep in her soul. This was it. This was the feeling she had never had with Thomas. This was two people who just fit in every single way that truly mattered. So what happens now? She asked after a while, pulling back just enough to see his face. Well, now I stop living at that boarding house and I start looking for a piece of land, Quinn said with certainty. I want to build that ranch I've always dreamed of. It is time to put down some real roots here in Oregon City, and I want you right there beside me, if you will have me. That sounds an awful lot like a proposal, Mr. Dalton, Bethany said, a smile spreading across her lips. Not quite yet, Quinn said, his tone serious. When I ask for your hand, it will be done proper, with a ring and everything a woman like you deserves, but I am telling you, that is the direction I am heading. It is where I hope we are heading. I want to marry you, Bethany. I want to make a life with you. I want that too, Bethany said, as a fresh wave of happy tears came. I want all of that with you. By the next morning, it seemed the whole of Oregon City knew that Quinn Dalton and Bethany Zimmerman were officially and truly courting. Not that most folks had ever doubted it. Mrs. Henderson was tickled pink, swearing up and down she knew from the very start they were made for each other. Mr. Chen gave them so many dumplings they had to share with half the town. 3 days later, Thomas and Eleanor left Oregon City for good. It seemed Thomas's business there wrapped up much quicker than he planned. Bethany watched their stagecoach roll away from the window of her shop, with Quinn's arms wrapped securely around her waist from behind, and she felt absolutely nothing at all. That part of her life was over, and she was more than ready for the new one that was just beginning. Quinn was a man of his word about finding land. He had managed to save up more money from his years of wandering than Bethany ever imagined. Within a month, he had bought 200 acres just on the edge of town. It was good grazing land with a creek running right through it, and a nice little stand of trees that would be the perfect spot for a house. It is not much to look at yet, he told her as they stood on a crisp October afternoon surveying the property. But I can see exactly what it is going to be. A house right there by the trees, a barn and stables over closer to the road, and pastures for the horses and cattle. It will take years to build it all up, but I am going to do it right. It sounds perfect, Bethany said, picturing it all right along with him. Can I help? I am not much good with building, but you could live there with me, Quinn cut in, turning to look her straight in the eye. As my wife. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He opened it, and inside was a simple gold band holding a single small diamond. It is not fancy, he said, looking a little nervous all of a sudden. But Bethany Zimmerman, you are the strongest, kindest, and most wonderful woman I have ever known. You make me want to be a better man, to build something that will last, to set down roots and never leave again. Will you marry me? Yes, Bethany said without a moment's hesitation. Yes, absolutely, yes. Quinn slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit like it was made just for her. Then he was kissing her again, lifting her right off the ground and spinning her around as she laughed with pure, boundless joy. They were married in early December, in the little town church with what felt like half of Oregon City watching. Bethany wore a gown she had sewn herself. It was simple, but lovely. And Quinn was in his best suit with his hair cut neat. The deputy marshal stood up as his best man, and Mrs. Henderson cried all the way through the service. They spent the winter months in Bethany's little apartment above the shop, while Quinn got to work building their house. He hired a few fellas from town to help, and Bethany would close her shop 3 days a week to go out and do whatever she could. She learned how to hammer a nail straight and true, how to measure a piece of wood just right, and how to think about foundations and support. Quinn was always patient with her, teaching her with that same gentle way he had with his horses. By the time spring arrived, the house was done. It was a beautiful 2-story home with big windows to catch the morning sun and a porch that wrapped around 3 whole sides. They moved in on the first warm day of May, hauling their furniture and all their belongings out to their new life together. Bethany kept her seamstress shop going, riding into town 3 days a week while Quinn worked on building up the ranch. He bought his first few horses that summer. They were magnificent animals that he trained with a gentle hand and incredible skill, and it was not long before his name as a horse trainer started to spread. Within a year, ranchers from all over the Oregon Territory were coming to buy one of Quinn Dalton's horses. Their life settled into a good and steady rhythm. It was full of hard work, but it was balanced by quiet evenings spent on the porch, just watching the sun go down over their land. They would talk about everything, and they would talk about nothing, sharing their dreams and their worries, and the simple things they saw each day. Quinn taught Bethany how to ride a horse properly, and she taught him how to dance, practicing right there in their kitchen while she hummed the tunes. It was in the fall of 1878, almost 2 years after that unforgettable day on Main Street, that Bethany realized she was pregnant. She had a feeling for a few weeks, but she wanted to be sure before she said anything to Quinn. When she finally told him, they were sitting on their porch as the setting sun painted the whole world in shades of gold. He went so still that for a moment she thought he had not even heard her. "Quinn," she said, her voice a little shaky, "did you hear me?" He turned his head to look at her, and his eyes were filled with tears. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so gently you would think she was made of fine china. "A baby," he whispered into her hair. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Bethany asked, even though she could feel the answer in the way he was holding her tight. "Happy is not a big enough word for this," Quinn said, his voice thick with emotion. "Bethany, you have given me every single thing I never even knew I was missing. A home, a family, a reason to get up every morning feeling grateful, and now this. A child. I just do not have the words to tell you what I'm feeling right now." Their son was born in May of 1879. He came into the world on a warm spring morning after a long night of labor. Quinn had paced the floor downstairs while Mrs. Henderson and the midwife helped Bethany, nearly wearing a rut in the new wood. The second he heard that first cry, he bounded up the stairs, 2 at a time, and flew into the bedroom looking half wild. "It's a boy," Mrs. Henderson said with a proud smile, laying the tiny infant in Bethany's arms. "He's healthy and strong, and from the sound of that holler, he's got his daddy's lungs." Quinn just collapsed onto the bed next to Bethany, gazing at their son in pure wonder. The little fella had Quinn's dark hair and Bethany's green eyes, and he was just as perfect as could be. "What should we name him?" Bethany whispered, her fingers tracing the baby's soft cheek. "James," Quinn said after a spell, "after your father. He would have loved this. He would have loved seeing you this happy." Tears welled up in Bethany's eyes. "James Dalton. That's perfect." James was a cheerful baby who grew into a little whirlwind of a toddler, keeping his folks on their toes day and night. Quinn took to fatherhood like a duck to water, always patient and full of fun, teaching his boy all about horses and cattle with a boundless spirit. Watching them together, Bethany felt her heart swell up with a kind of love she never knew existed. 2 years on, their little girl was born right in the middle of a booming summer thunderstorm. They called her Rose, and she had Quinn's honey-colored eyes and Bethany's own stubborn streak. Where James was careful and thought things through, Rose was a little spitfire, climbing on anything she could get her hands on and finding new ways to get into mischief all the time. The ranch did better than they had ever hoped. Quinn's good name brought in plenty of business, and soon they bought more land, added on to the house, and hired some hands to help out. Bethany finally sold her dressmaker's shop to a nice young woman who'd just moved out from the East. She kept a few of her favorite customers and worked from the house, which let her spend more time with her children. Oregon City was growing up too, changing from a rough-and-tumble frontier outpost into a real town. New folks were moving in, shops were getting bigger, and things started to feel a little more settled. Through all of it, Quinn and Bethany became pillars of the community. Folks you could count on for being fair and welcoming, and you couldn't miss how much they loved each other. Every now and then, Bethany would remember that awful day she stood frozen on the street, watching Thomas show up with his new wife, feeling like her whole world had just crumbled. She never saw Thomas again after he rode out of town. But she heard tell that his marriage went sour, his business dried up, and he just drifted from town to town, chasing a success that was always just out of his reach. She didn't find any joy in his hard times, but goodness, she was grateful for the way her own life had turned out. If Thomas hadn't shattered her heart, if he hadn't paraded back into Oregon City that day, she might never have found Quinn. She might never have understood what real love was, or what it meant to build a life with a man who was your true partner in every single thing. For their 10th anniversary, Quinn cooked up a surprise trip. He got Mrs. Henderson to watch the kids for a couple of days, and he took Bethany high up into the mountains to a gorgeous lake ringed with wildflowers. They spent 3 days camping, just talking and laughing and loving each other under the stars. They felt like a couple of kids again, not the tired parents of 2 rowdy children. "You ever regret it?" Quinn asked one night while they were curled up by the fire with Bethany resting right against his side. "Settling for a horse rancher instead of holding out for someone with more money." "Settling." Bethany lifted her head and gave him a look of pure astonishment. "Quinn Dalton, you are the farthest thing from settling I could ever imagine. You are a dream I never even had the nerve to have." "Good," Quinn said, pulling her in even tighter, "because you are stuck with me for the long haul." "Forever sounds just right to me," Bethany answered, and gave him a soft kiss. They came home to the sound of their children squealing with excitement, James and Rose nearly knocking them over with stories about everything they had missed. That evening, long after the little ones were tucked in bed, Quinn and Bethany stood on the porch, looking out at their land with their hands clasped between them. "You remember when all this was just a patch of dirt and a big dream?" Quinn asked quietly. I remember being scared to death and completely heartbroken. And then you came along to save me, Bethany said, squeezing his hand. I did not save you, Quinn corrected her softly. You saved yourself. I just made sure you did not have to go it alone. We saved each other, Bethany decided, and we built something real fine together. The years kept rolling by like they always do, filled with little moments of joy and some sadness here and there. The children grew, the ranch got bigger, and the love between them deepened, a love that came from choosing one another every single day. James grew up to be a fine young man who loved the horses just as much as his dad did, while Rose became such a good rider she could outshoot most of the ranch hands before she was even 12. In 1890, when Bethany was 37 and Quinn was 39, they were blessed with a third child, another son they named Daniel. He was a complete surprise, but the whole family welcomed him with open arms, and James and Rose watched over their baby brother like a couple of mother hens. Quinn's hair started to get a little silver at the temples, and happy little lines formed around Bethany's eyes, but they still looked at each other like they were brand new sweethearts. They still danced around the kitchen, talked for hours out on the porch, and reached for each other in the dark of night like two halves of a whole. The ranch got a reputation all over Oregon as one of the best horse operations around, and rich folks would come all the way from California to buy one of Quinn Dalton's well-trained animals. But all that success never changed the man Quinn was deep down. He was still steady, honest, and completely devoted to his family. Bethany published her very first book in 1895, a collection of stories about life on the frontier that took everybody by surprise, especially her. She had just started jotting down little memories in the evenings after the children were asleep. But it was Quinn who told her she should turn them into something more. A publisher up in Portland decided to take a chance on it, and just like that, Bethany Dalton wasn't just a rancher's wife anymore. She was a real author. "Just look at you," Quinn said, his voice thick with pride, when the first printed book arrived. He held her close while she cried happy tears. "You always wanted adventure, and now you are sharing yours with the whole world." "You are my greatest adventure," Bethany told him, and she meant it with every piece of her heart. By the time the new century rolled around, James was running most of the day-to-day work on the ranch. He was a responsible 21-year-old who had his father's knack with horses and his mother's head for business. Rose had stunned them all by declaring she was going to be a doctor, and she headed off to a medical school back east with her parents' full blessing and support. Daniel, at 10 years old, was still figuring out who he wanted to be, trying on different dreams like they were coats until he found the one that fit just right. Quinn and Bethany were in their mid-40s by then, and their bodies showed the signs of hard work and a hard-won happiness. They had made it through droughts and bitter winters, sick kids and tough birthing seasons, all the usual troubles that come with carving out a life in a land that was still pretty wild. But they had faced it all side by side, and that was what mattered. One evening in the summer of 1901, 25 years after that crazy day on Main Street, they sat on their porch and watched the sunset paint the sky with streaks of orange and pink. Their grandkids were playing out in the yard. James had married a wonderful woman named Catherine 2 years before, and they had a little boy and a new baby girl. Even Rose was home visiting, taking a break from her doctor studies to be with her family. "Do you remember how terrified I was that I'd have to see Thomas and Alner all by myself?" Bethany asked, her head resting on Quinn's shoulder. "I remember thinking you were the prettiest woman I had ever laid eyes on, even when you looked like you wanted the boardwalk to just swallow you whole," Quinn answered, his arm wrapped tight around her waist. "I was so sure my life was over," Bethany said, thinking back. "I thought seeing him with his new wife was the worst thing in the world that could happen to me." "And it turned out to be the best thing," Quinn said, and he placed a soft kiss on her temple. "Because it led me right to you." "It led us to each other," Bethany corrected, turning her head to kiss him right. "Every good thing in my life began on that day, when a kind cowboy made sure I did not have to stand up to my old fiancé all alone. I would do it again in a heartbeat, Quinn told her. I would do anything for you, Bethany. Back then, right now, always. I know, she said softly, her hand reaching up to touch his weathered cheek. And that is what makes this life we have so special. It is built on real love, a true partnership, and a solid promise. Not the kind of empty words Thomas used to say, but never meant. They sat there as the sun finally sank below the hills, turning their world to gold and shadows. The sound of their children's and grandchildren's laughter floated up from the yard, the sweet music of the life they had made together. The ranch stretched out all around them, thriving and beautiful, a real and solid thing born from their dreams. Bethany Zimmerman, the girl who was once left broken-hearted and ashamed, had found something so much better than the life she had once planned. She had found Quinn Dalton, a good-hearted cowboy with steady hands, who showed up right when she needed him the very most. What they had built together was more than a ranch. It was a legacy forged from hard work and an honest love. They raised good children and built a partnership that had survived every kind of storm. Each evening, as they watched the sun go down, Bethany would send up a silent prayer of thanks for the day her ex-fiancé showed up with his new wife. That terrible day had pushed her toward Quinn. It had brought her to her real home, and it delivered her to a life far more wonderful than any adventure she had ever imagined from a book. She leaned back into Quinn's embrace, the steady beat of his heart a comfort against her. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was where she belonged. It was not because she settled for less or because she gave up on a dream, but because she had found the one soul on earth who saw every part of her and loved her still, who had stood by her for 25 years. And she knew he would stand right there beside her for whatever time they were given. I love you, she whispered, the words feeling just as powerful as they had the first time she said them in her shop all those years back. I love you too, Quinn said back, his voice full of feeling. Always have, and I always will. As the first stars began to speckle the darkening sky over their land, Bethany smiled. She let herself settle into the pure peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are supposed to be, with the exact person you are supposed to be with, living a life that made every single past heartache worth it, model,